our packet when we studied ecosystems, but we also studied some cycles that were on a worksheet that we did separately from our packet. So the first one we're going to go over is the carbon cycle. So sources of carbon. First thing you need to know is that carbon is in all living things. So anything that's living has carbon. All right. In a diagram, you're going to mainly see CO2 marked, coming from humans and animals. So humans and animals breathing out CO2. So what uses carbon then? So things that take in carbon are things that go through photosynthesis, main one being plants. Cyanobacteria also uses carbon, mainly in the form of CO2. Algae, Euglena, Volvox. Euglena and Volvox were protists that you talked about in 7th grade and also in 8th grade. And how do humans impact the carbon cycle? So in a diagram, typically you're going to see that we burn fossil fuels. So you may see a factory giving off CO2. You maybe see cars giving off CO2. And what do fossil fuels have to do with the carbon cycle? Well, when they are burned, they release CO2. So when they are burned, they release CO2. So the more we burn, the more it goes into the atmosphere, causing some pollution usually. All right, next cycle is the oxygen cycle. So sources of oxygen, kind of the opposite of the carbon cycle here, because sources of oxygen are going to be plants and anything that undergoes photosynthesis. So plants and things that undergo photosynthesis like cyanobacteria, algae, Euglena, and Volvox that we listed up here. So what uses oxygen? What takes in? Another way of saying that is what takes in oxygen. People and animals take in oxygen through respiration. Okay, and it's a cycle, so it loops back around, right? And all of these cycles, all these 4 cycles we're talking about, happen simultaneously. They're not, you know, separate from each other. One doesn't happen and then the next happen. Everything's going on in our environment all at once. All right, the nitrogen cycle. Where does nitrogen come from? So this is a little bit different. The most nitrogen is in our atmosphere. So I'm writing most equals atmosphere. And then we also see diagrams that show us that nitrogen is in animal waste. All right, so what uses nitrogen? So living things use nitrogen. Plants use nitrogen. But before plants and living things can use nitrogen, they have to go through what's called nitrogen fixation. So let's talk about why plants need nitrogen first. So we had a warm-up question that talked about plants needing nitrogen to increase protein production. So an increase in protein production is going to help plants grow more efficiently. So before plants use those proteins, nitrogen fixation has to happen. So let's take the animal waste, for instance. So the animal waste is in the ground, and bacteria in the soil and microbes in the soil are going to take the ammonia, that NH3 and nitrogen that are in that animal waste, and they're going to change it into usable nitrogen called nitrates. So ammonia and nitrites are changed into nitrates, which plants can use. Okay, so in our diagram that we saw, bacteria in the soil was doing nitrogen fixation. Bacteria can also be in water, so blue-green bacteria. And then also another source of nitrogen fixation is lightning. What are legumes? So legumes are on plant roots, and they are peanuts, soybeans, clovers, and they also help fix nitrogen. All right, moving on to the water cycle. So we know all these four parts even from grade school. So this should definitely be another review, even after a review during the year. So evaporation, what's happening is we're going from liquid surface water to gas. So it's turning into gas and entering the atmosphere. Condensation is where water vapor, which is a gas, cools down and turns into liquid droplets. We see this in diagrams by the clouds, right? And then coming from the clouds, usually in a diagram of the water cycle, we see precipitation, so that's liquid water coming from the clouds, rain, snow, sleet, and hail. Transpiration is shown from plants, and that's liquid from plant leaves turning into gas and entering the atmosphere. So liquid from plant leaves turns into gas and enters atmosphere. So those are our 4 cycles. All right. Population limiting factors. So there are factors that can limit the population. The first one is abiotic factors. And using our stems, A means not, bio means life. So these are things that are non-living in the ecosystem. So non-living factors in our ecosystem. And there are a lot of them, but several important ones are sunlight, water, climate, rocks, lots and lots of things we could list here. Biotic factors, living factors that affect our ecosystem, are living factors. Okay, main ones are plants, animals, humans. Lots of things affect our ecosystem that are living. This is where it gets a little bit tricky when they talk about population density dependent limiting factors. So these are things that affect a population and depend on the population size. So they do have an impact when the population is large and dense. So these are things, a real easy one to understand is disease. So if our population is very dense and large, disease is going to spread very quickly and easily, right? Competition, predation. Okay, there's a predator-prey graph up at the top here. So, and it talks about population density and time. So remember, you know, as the prey population goes up, the predator population is going to go up. Same on the flip side, right? As the predator population goes down, prey is going to also go down. All right, another one is parasitism. Parasites. All right, and then we have population density independent. So independent from the population. So they reduce the size of all populations in the area regardless of the population size, whether it's big or small. So abiotic factors will affect all populations. So things like temperature, and I'm just going to shorten that to temp. All right, precipitation, sunlight. So we've got to have sunlight to for plants to grow, right? Human activities like pollution is a limiting factor, right? So if our lake is very polluted because of human activities that have occurred, we're not going to see large populations of fish and other living organisms in that lake. All right, and then natural disasters. Okay, natural disasters can definitely affect populations of living things, no matter how big the population. All right, we talked a lot about symbiosis when we talked about ecosystems, and so that is going to be the relationships between two living things. So parasitism is one where one organism benefits and the other one is harmed. There were lots of examples of this. So one organism, which is typically the parasite. So the parasite benefits and the other is harmed. A real simple one that a lot of people remember is a tick and a dog. So the tick is the parasite, the dog is the host. All right, commensalism. This is where one organism benefits, the other one is not affected. So when we say unaffected, we mean it's neither helped or harmed. So one example we talked about was the remora and the shark. Okay, the remora attaches itself to the shark and, you know, gets a free ride on the shark. It's not harming the shark at all. And the remora gets the scraps of food that the shark doesn't eat. And then mutualism, lots of examples of this again, both organisms benefit. A real common example that's talked about is the bee and the flower. So the pollination of the flower, both the bee and the flower benefit from that